Standing alone in the courtroom, Naomi Carter faced a judge who smirked at her like she was already guilty. Framed for a crime she didn't commit, she had no lawyer, no allies. Just the truth. But little did the judge know, she had already set a plan in motion that could bring his entire empire crashing down. Would she survive long enough to see justice served? What would you do if the system was rigged against you? Let us know in the comments. Now, let's dive into Naomi's gripping fight for justice, one that would shake the very foundations of the court itself. The courtroom was silent, but the air was thick with judgment. Naomi Carter stood alone, her back straight, her grip tightening around the black folder in her hands. It was the only thing she had left, her shield, her last hope. No lawyer, no family, no one sitting behind her in silent support. She stole a glance at the crowded courtroom. A sea of unfamiliar faces. Some whispered behind cupped hands. A few shook their heads, already convinced of her guilt. A man in the front row watched with detached amusement, as if this was just another piece of courtroom theater. Then there was him. Judge Richard Calloway. Seated high on the bench, towering over the room like a king surveying his domain. His silver hair, neatly combed back, glistened under the dim courtroom lights. His black robe draped over his frame like a cloak of absolute authority. But it wasn't the robe that made Naomi's skin crawl. It was the smirk. A slow, deliberate curve of his lips, one that spoke volumes without a single word. A smirk that said, "I've already decided your fate." "Miss Carter," he finally spoke, his voice dripping with controlled amusement. His fingers tapped lightly against the polished wood of his bench. "You stand accused of embezzling $90,000 from Crest Hill Bank. Fraud, breach of contract, a serious offense." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. Then, with a tilt of his head, he added, "And yet, no attorney? No representation? Are you truly that confident or just reckless?" A low murmur spread through the crowd. Naomi's pulse pounded in her ears. This was all part of the game. A game where the rules were rigged from the start. The false accusations, the missing money, the fabricated records. Every piece of evidence had been carefully placed to make her look guilty. And Judge Calloway knew it. He wasn't just delivering justice, he was orchestrating her downfall. And he was enjoying it. For a brief moment, fear tightened around her chest like a vice. The weight of it all pressed down on her, her job, her freedom, her 6-year-old daughter, Ava, waiting at home with a neighbor, probably clutching her stuffed rabbit, wondering when mommy would be back. But Calloway didn't see the fear in her eyes. What he missed was the fire behind it. Because Naomi Carter wasn't the helpless victim he thought she was. She had spent weeks gathering information, connecting the dots, tracing the corruption to the source. When she realized the web of deception stretched beyond the bank into the very walls of this courtroom, she did the only thing she could. She sent everything to the FBI. And now, she just had to hold her ground. Because when the truth came crashing down, it wouldn't just clear her name. It would bring down Judge Calloway and every corrupt man standing behind him. Before she became the accused, before her name was dragged through the mud, before she stood alone in that cold courtroom, Naomi Carter was just a woman trying to build a life for her daughter. She had never been the type to dream of luxury. She didn't have time for that. Her life revolved around one thing, Ava, 6 years old, with bright brown eyes full of curiosity, always asking questions, always reaching for her mother's hand. Every morning, Naomi woke up before the sun, packed Ava's lunch, kissed her forehead, and told her, "Mommy loves you. Be good today." Then she made the long commute to Crest Hill Bank, the place where she had worked for almost a decade. She had earned that job with grit, no favors, no shortcuts. She started at the bottom, processing loan applications, handling customer disputes, slowly working her way up. She was thorough, efficient, a woman who knew every decimal point mattered. She thought it was enough. But in the world she lived in, hard work didn't always mean security. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, right after lunch. A meeting request popped up in her inbox, HR, 2:30 p.m. Naomi felt a strange weight in her chest as she stepped into the office. The air was too still, the blinds half drawn as if to shut out the world. 2 people were waiting for her, her manager, Thomas Grayson, and an HR representative she barely knew. She barely had time to sit before Grayson slid a thick folder across the desk. "We need to talk, Naomi," he said, his voice measured impersonal. "There's been an internal investigation. Discrepancies in financial records, money funneled into unauthorized accounts." She blinked, not understanding. Then he said it. $90,000 transferred under your login credentials. The words slammed into her like a fist. "What?" Naomi's voice cracked. "That's impossible." But Grayson wasn't listening. He continued flipping through pages, printed screenshots, transaction logs, account statements, all pointing to her. She felt her breath hitch. Her signature was on the forms. Her username had authorized the transfers. It was her. Only it wasn't. "This must be a mistake," Naomi said, forcing herself to stay calm. We've already reviewed the evidence." His voice was final, cold. "Your access has been revoked. Effective immediately, your employment is terminated." She sat frozen. Just like that? A decade of work? Erased? No chance to explain? The HR rep slid a termination letter across the desk. "We'll need you to gather your belongings." Naomi stared at the paper. The ink on the page blurred as her mind raced. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. She hadn't stolen a dime, but none of that mattered, because whoever had set this up had done it perfectly. Naomi sat frozen, the termination letter gripped tightly in her hands. Fired, accused, discarded. Just like that. But this wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. Someone had orchestrated this. At first, she wanted to believe it was a clerical error, maybe a glitch in the system. But as the hours ticked by, the weight of reality pressed down on her like a heavy stone. The evidence against her was too perfect. The transactions, the signatures, the timestamps, it was a setup. And then, the truth hit her like a blow to the chest. The regional director of Crest Hill Bank. A man who rarely spoke to employees like her, unless he had a reason to. His name was always whispered in hushed conversations, spoken with the kind of wariness reserved for men who held power in invisible ways. Naomi had never questioned him before. She never had to. But now, she saw the pattern. She wasn't the first. A deep dive into the bank's history revealed a disturbing trend. Employees just like her, suddenly dismissed under suspicious circumstances. Some for financial discrepancies, some for policy violations they swore they never committed. And all of them had something in common. They worked in departments handling high-value transactions. They were terminated just before major financial audits. And once they were gone, the investigations quietly disappeared. Walter Hensley didn't just run the bank, he ran a well-oiled machine of corruption. Money moved in and out of unseen accounts, numbers shifted in the dead of night, and when things got too risky, someone had to take the fall. This time, that someone was Naomi. And she might have had a chance to fight back, if Judge Richard Calloway wasn't part of the machine too. The connection became clear. Walter Hensley and Judge Calloway weren't just acquaintances, they were partners. Calloway's courtroom had been used again and again to silence people like Naomi, people who got too close to the truth. His rulings ensured the accused were buried under legal charges they couldn't fight. And now, she was next. This wasn't just about her job. This was a system designed to destroy people like her. And if she didn't find a way to fight back, they wouldn't just ruin her. They would erase her, just like they had erased the others. Naomi sat at her small kitchen table, her fingers clenched around the stack of papers in front of her. Court summons, eviction notice, a final warning from the bank. Everything was crumbling. Her first instinct had been to find a lawyer, someone, anyone, who could help her fight this. She spent hours calling firms, leaving voicemails, waiting for callbacks that never came. The few who did answer were polite, but their responses were all the same. "I'm sorry, Miss Carter. We're unable to take on your case at this time. Given the parties involved, we don't believe we can effectively represent you. A case against Judge Calloway? That would be difficult." She could hear the fear in their voices. Richard Calloway wasn't just any judge. He had connections, powerful ones. No firm in Crest Hill was willing to challenge him, and so Naomi turned to the people she thought she could trust. Her coworkers, her friends. But one by one, they disappeared. She sent texts that went unanswered. Calls went straight to voicemail. The few who did pick up sounded nervous, their words clipped and distant. "I can't get involved, Naomi. I have a family to think about. I'm sorry, but I need this job. Maybe you should just let it go." Let it go. The words left a bitter taste in her mouth. She wasn't just losing a case, she was losing everything. Days passed in a blur. She barely slept, barely ate. And when the notice came, the one she had been dreading, her hands shook as she tore open the envelope. A final eviction warning. Past due balance, $1,350. Due immediately. Her rent. She hadn't been able to pay it since losing her job. Naomi closed her eyes, pressing her fingers to her temples. She had less than a week before she and Ava would be out on the street. Ava. The thought of her daughter made her stomach twist. How could she explain this to her? Lately, Ava had started noticing things. The tension in her mother's voice, the way she flinched every time the phone rang, the quiet moments when Naomi thought she was alone and let the fear show on her face. One evening, as Naomi sat at the table, staring blankly at a pile of unpaid bills, Ava climbed onto her lap, small arms wrapping around her mother's shoulders. "Mommy," she whispered, "are we in trouble?" Naomi felt her throat tighten. How was she supposed to answer that? She wanted to tell her, "No, baby, everything is fine." But Ava was too smart for that. So instead, Naomi just held her close, resting her chin on her daughter's soft curls, whispering, "I'm gonna fix this. I promise." But deep down, she didn't know how. Because every door had been slammed shut in her face. And if she didn't find a way to fight back soon, she and Ava would lose everything. Naomi had stopped expecting help. Every lawyer had turned her away. Her friends had vanished. Her world had shrunk to the walls of her tiny apartment, the looming eviction notice on the kitchen table, and the sound of Ava's soft breathing at night. The only thing grounding her in a reality that felt more like a nightmare. Then, one evening, as she sat outside a cafe, nursing a cup of coffee she couldn't afford, a woman slid into the seat across from her. She was in her late 30s, sharp-eyed, with an air of quiet intensity. A notepad rested on the table beside her, and her fingers drummed lightly against it as she studied Naomi. "Miss Carter," she said, her voice low but firm. "My name is Rebecca Lane. I'm an investigative journalist for the Crest Hill Times, and I believe you." Naomi blinked. Rebecca leaned in, voice just above a whisper. "I've been following Judge Calloway's rulings for over a year now. The inconsistencies, the unusually harsh sentences, the cases that disappear before they reach appeal. And then there's your case, a fraud accusation based on evidence that seems just a little too perfect." Naomi stiffened, her mind racing. "How do you know about my case?" Rebecca smirked, tapping her notepad. "I make it my job to know things." She took a breath, her expression turning serious. "Listen, I don't think this is just about you. I think Calloway has been covering up fraud for years, maybe even decades. But I need proof, something solid enough to make the city and the courts pay attention." Naomi hesitated. For weeks, she had been drowning, watching her life unravel with no one willing to help. And now, suddenly, a stranger believed her? It felt too good to be true. As if sensing her hesitation, Rebecca pulled a small card from her pocket and slid it across the table. "My number," she said. "Think about it." Then she stood, buttoning her coat. "You're not crazy, Naomi. You're not alone. If you're ready to fight back, call me." And just like that, she was gone. The second time hope appeared, it came in the form of a phone call. Naomi had just put Ava to bed when her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She almost ignored it. But something in her gut told her to pick up. "Miss Carter?" A deep male voice, calm but authoritative. "This is Special Agent Daniel Cheng with the FBI." Naomi sat up straight, gripping the phone. "I understand this is unexpected," he continued, "but I'd like to talk, in private." She swallowed hard. "FBI? What is this about?" There was a pause. Then, "We've been looking into Crest Hill Bank for months." Her breath caught. "We know about Walter Hensley," Cheng said, "and we suspect he's been laundering money for years. We also believe Judge Calloway is involved, using his position to protect Hensley and eliminate threats." Naomi's pulse pounded in her ears. "You mean?" She could barely form the words. "You mean they set me up because I got too close?" "We think so," Cheng confirmed. "But we don't have enough to bring them down. Not yet." She closed her eyes, so it was real. All of it. She hadn't been imagining things. "They destroyed my life," she whispered. "How do we stop them?" There was a beat of silence before Cheng replied, his voice steady and certain. "We need evidence. Real, undeniable proof. And that means we need you, Miss Carter." Naomi wasn't sure if she should feel relief or terror. For the first time, she wasn't alone in this fight. but she also wasn't safe. Because now she wasn't just a woman falsely accused of a crime. She was a threat. And if Calloway or Hensley got even the slightest hint that she was working against them, they wouldn't just ruin her. They would make sure she disappeared. Naomi had always believed that the truth could set you free. But the more she searched for it, the more she realized truth could also get you killed. She had been careful. She kept her head down. She met Rebecca Lane in out-of-the-way coffee shops, always choosing a seat near the back, always watching the door. She kept her phone off at night, wary of strange numbers calling. She double-checked the locks on her door, made sure Ava never walked home from school alone. But none of it mattered, because they knew. It started with the disappearance of their key witness. A former Crest Hill Bank employee, someone Rebecca had tracked down, someone who had worked directly under Walter Hensley. A man who had agreed to testify that fraudulent accounts had been created under Naomi's credentials, that he had seen her name being used on transactions she never authorized. Then one night, he simply vanished. His phone disconnected, his apartment abandoned. No notes, no messages, just gone. Rebecca cursed under her breath when she got the news, pacing back and forth as Naomi sat frozen in her chair. He was scared, Rebecca muttered. He said he thought someone was watching him. Naomi swallowed hard. And now he's just missing? Rebecca's eyes met hers. This isn't a coincidence, Naomi. It wasn't. This was a warning. Then came the break-in. It happened just past midnight. Naomi woke with a start to the sound of rustling, a presence, a shadow moving through her living room. Her heart pounded as she reached for her phone, but the power was out. No light, no Wi-Fi, just darkness. She held her breath, listening. Footsteps. A slow, deliberate movement. Ava. Her mind screamed her daughter's name, but she didn't move, didn't breathe. Whoever was in her house wasn't here to steal. They wanted to send a message, and they did. The next morning she found a single envelope placed neatly on her kitchen counter. No address, no name, just 2 words written in black ink. Stop now. Her hands trembled as she held the paper. They had been inside her home. Inside, while she and Ava were sleeping. She sat at the table staring at the note, nausea twisting in her gut. She had no doubt, if she kept pushing, things would get worse. For the first time she questioned herself. Was she willing to risk her life for this? Was she willing to risk Ava's? She didn't know the answer, until she received the email. It arrived 2 nights later, just after midnight. A blocked sender, no subject line, just a single attachment and one short message. You're not crazy. They did this to you. Naomi hesitated, fingers hovering over the screen. She wasn't stupid. She knew opening anonymous files was dangerous. But something told her this was different. She tapped the attachment. A spreadsheet appeared. Transactions, dates, account numbers, all stamped with her name. She frowned, scrolling through the data, her confusion quickly turning to horror. Each entry was marked with a secondary login signature. A signature that didn't belong to her. Someone inside the bank had manipulated the records. They had altered the system, forged her credentials, moved the money without her ever knowing. Proof. She had proof. Naomi's breath came fast and shallow as she scrolled to the bottom, where a final note had been added. This goes deeper than you think. Be careful. She stared at the screen, her pulse racing. She didn't know who had sent this. She didn't know why. But one thing was certain. Whoever they were, they wanted her to win. And for the first time in weeks, Naomi felt something she hadn't dared to hold on to before. Hope. The courtroom was packed, every seat taken, every whisper laced with anticipation. The scent of old varnished wood and stale coffee filled the air, mixing with the quiet murmurs of spectators who had come to watch the spectacle unfold. And at the center of it all, Naomi Carter, standing at the defendant's table, alone. Across the room, Judge Richard Calloway adjusted his robe, his silver hair glinting under the fluorescent lights. That same smug smirk curled on his lips, the one Naomi had seen in every hearing leading up to this moment. He was in control, and he knew it. Let's proceed, Calloway said smoothly, his voice carrying a hint of boredom, as if this was nothing more than a formality. The prosecution wasted no time. Jacob Rowan, the district attorney, strode confidently to the center of the room, buttoning his sleek navy suit as he faced the jury. A man who knew exactly how to twist reality into something unrecognizable. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, we are here today because of one undeniable truth. Naomi Carter is a thief. A murmur rippled through the jury box. Naomi's nails dug into the surface of the table. Rowan continued, his voice carrying the perfect balance of authority and persuasion. This case isn't about speculation. It's about evidence. Hard, indisputable facts. He turned to the jury, his gaze sharp. The financial records, the security logs, the transactions, all traced back to her credentials. The numbers don't lie. He stepped closer to the jury box, his voice dropping just slightly, forcing them to lean in. Miss Carter betrayed her employer's trust. She exploited her position at Crest Hill Bank to funnel $90,000 into fraudulent accounts, and when she was caught, she played the victim. He gestured toward Naomi with an almost condescending sigh, but actions have consequences. He turned back to the jury. And today, you will see the evidence for yourselves. You will see the truth. Naomi's stomach twisted. The evidence they had built against her was a perfect illusion, one carefully crafted by men who had mastered the art of deception. And now, it was her turn to fight back. Naomi stood. She took a breath, steadying herself. My name is Naomi Carter, she began, her voice clear, though her hands trembled slightly. I have worked at Crest Hill Bank for almost 10 years, and I did not steal $90,000. She turned to the jury, forcing herself to meet their eyes. I am a mother, a hard worker, someone who has dedicated years to this job, to my daughter. Why would I suddenly decide to throw all of that away? She reached for the folder in front of her, the one with the evidence that should have proven her innocence. But before she could continue, Rowan was already shaking his head. Objection, Your Honor, he said, almost lazily. The defendant is appealing to emotion rather than addressing the facts. Calloway didn't even hesitate, sustained. Naomi's throat tightened. She had facts. She had evidence that her login credentials had been used by someone else, that the records had been altered. But every time she tried to present them, objection, sustained, again and again. It was a rigged game, a script already written. And the jury, they were listening. Naomi could see it in their eyes, the subtle shift, the way doubt began to settle in. And that was exactly what Calloway and Rowan wanted. As the hours stretched on, the case unfolded exactly as Calloway had planned. The prosecution paraded their fabricated evidence. Screenshots of transactions, witness testimonies from bank employees carefully coached on what to say. Naomi fought to speak, fought to defend herself, but every argument was dismissed. And slowly, the jury's sympathy faded. She could see it happening, the way their expressions hardened, the way the weight of the so-called facts pressed down on them. One of the jurors, a middle-aged man in a dark brown suit, glanced at her with something almost like pity, like he had already made up his mind. Naomi felt her stomach drop. This was it. They were going to convict her. And if that happened, there would be no second chance. Her hands clenched into fists under the table. She refused to go down like this. Something had to happen. And then, it did. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Naomi's hands gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. The jury had been swayed. She could feel it, the weight of their judgment pressing down on her. The verdict was coming. She glanced at Calloway sitting high on his bench, that smug smirk still plastered on his face. He leaned forward slightly, as if savoring the moment, as if he had already won. The prosecutor cleared his throat, turning to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence is overwhelming. Miss Carter is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. It is time to deliver justice. Naomi's breath hitched. This was it. The judge lifted his gavel, his fingers curled around the polished wood, his smirk deepening. He was about to destroy her life. Then, the courtroom doors burst open. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as two men in dark suits strode inside, badges flashing. Special Agent Daniel Cheng, FBI. This court proceeding is now interrupted under federal jurisdiction. For the first time since the trial began, Calloway's smirk vanished. The room erupted into chaos. Murmurs turned into shouts. The prosecutor spun around, stunned. The jury exchanged bewildered glances. Naomi sat frozen. She knew Cheng had been working on the case, but she hadn't expected this. The agent stepped forward, his voice sharp and unwavering. We have obtained substantial evidence proving that this trial was manipulated, that Naomi Carter was framed. Gasps. The air grew thick with confusion, disbelief. Calloway straightened in his chair, his jaw tight. "This is outrageous," he barked. "I don't know what kind of stunt—" But Cheng cut him off with a single motion of his hand. A file slammed down onto the prosecutor's desk. "Then maybe you can explain this, Your Honor." The prosecutor hesitated, reaching for the file. His face paled as he flipped through its contents. A series of emails, transactions, bank records, documents linking Walter Hensley directly to Calloway. And then the final piece, a grainy but damning video file. The screen flickered to life on the court's projector. Calloway, seated in a dimly lit office, accepting a thick envelope from Walter Hensley. His voice crackled through the speakers. "Consider it a token of appreciation, Judge, for making problems disappear." A collective gasp swept the room. The color drained from Calloway's face. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "This is fabricated." But the evidence kept coming. Financial records showed the exact moment Naomi's credentials had been used fraudulently. A digital footprint tracing back to Hensley's office. Naomi had never touched that money. And now everyone in the room knew it. "Judge Richard Calloway," Cheng's voice rang out, cutting through the tension like a blade. "You are under arrest for obstruction of justice, bribery, and conspiracy." A stunned silence. Then, the sound of handcuffs clicking into place. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled for their phones. The jury sat in shock. The prosecutor, the very man who had argued so confidently against Naomi, stared at Calloway like he had just been handed a death sentence himself. Naomi's chest rose and fell rapidly. She couldn't believe it. This wasn't just her freedom. This was justice. She watched as Calloway struggled against the agents, his arrogance turning into sheer panic. "This is a mistake. You can't do this to me. I am the law." Cheng didn't blink. Not anymore. The judge, the man who had smirked at her suffering, was dragged out of his own courtroom. And Naomi, for the first time in months, she could breathe. The courtroom was still in shock. The once mighty Judge Richard Calloway, a man who had spent years ruling over others with unchecked arrogance, now stood frozen in disbelief. His silver hair, always neatly combed, was now disheveled from the frantic way he had run his hands through it. His once smug smirk had collapsed into something hollow, something close to fear. His wrists, now bound in steel cuffs, were held firmly by 2 FBI agents as the world he had built for himself came crashing down. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice a desperate growl. Cheng barely glanced at him. "Yes, it is." The air in the room had shifted. The same jury who had once looked at Naomi with doubt now stared at Calloway in horrified realization. The prosecution sat in stunned silence, their carefully crafted case against Naomi reduced to ashes. The ripple effect was immediate. Within hours, the headlines spread like wildfire. Judge Calloway arrested in corruption scandal. FBI uncovers widespread judicial bribery. Falsely convicted victims to have cases reopened. Naomi could hardly believe it. The courtroom was no longer her prison. It had become Calloway's. The FBI wasted no time. Within days of Calloway's arrest, investigators uncovered a corruption ring that reached far beyond him. Walter Hensley, the mastermind behind the fraudulent banking scheme, was also taken into custody, his polished confidence shattered as evidence piled against him. But the corruption didn't stop there. Calloway had been just one piece of a far greater machine. Through seized financial records, secret wire transfers, and emails retrieved from encrypted servers, the FBI traced a web of bribery and fraud that stretched through the courts, banking institutions, and even local government officials. For years, Calloway had ruled his courtroom like a king, deciding which cases lived and died, based not on the law, but on who paid the highest price. And Naomi? She had been just one of dozens. Innocent people had been imprisoned, families torn apart, lives ruined. But now, they were getting their justice too. With Calloway's fall, his past rulings were brought under federal review. Case after case was reopened, convictions overturned, names cleared. Naomi wasn't the only one who'd been trapped in his game. But now, the game was over. Naomi stepped out of the courthouse and into the crisp afternoon air, her chest rising with the deepest breath she had taken in months. The weight, the crushing, suffocating weight, was finally gone. The sky above felt wider. The ground beneath her feet felt real again. She was free. And then she saw her. Ava. Her daughter stood just beyond the courthouse steps, small arms wrapped around the stuffed rabbit she never let go of. The moment their eyes met, Ava broke into a sprint. "Mommy." Naomi barely had time to kneel before Ava threw herself into her arms. The warmth of her tiny body, the scent of her hair, the soft hiccup of her tears, it shattered Naomi completely. She held Ava tighter than she ever had before, tears spilling down her face, this time not from fear, but relief. It was over. The cameras flashed. Reporters shouted her name. The world wanted to know how it felt to bring down one of the most powerful men in the system. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Naomi buried her face in her daughter's shoulder and whispered, "We're going home." Naomi had walked into that courthouse as a woman accused, fighting alone against a rigged system. She walked out as something more. Not just a survivor, not just someone who had cleared her own name, but the woman who tore down an empire of corruption. She didn't just win a case, she changed everything. If this story moved you, if Naomi's fight for justice reminded you that truth and perseverance can change everything, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and most importantly, subscribe so you never miss another powerful story like this. Your support means the world to us. It fuels our passion to keep bringing you stories that inspire, challenge, and shine a light on truth. Thank you for watching, and remember, justice always finds a way. Bookmark, go back.